Rhetoric, turning the argument back. Rhetoric, turning the argument back in May 1996, the journal Social Text, at the time one of the leading venues for what was called the cultural studies tradition in American academia, published an article by the New York University physicist Alan Sokal entitled Transgressing the Boundaries, Toward a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. The article ran to 20 pages. It cited 57 sources. It was peer-reviewed in the journal's standard process. The editors of Social Text introduced it as a contribution to the field by a respected physicist. The article was nonsense. Sokal had constructed it deliberately as nonsense to test whether a journal in the cultural studies tradition would publish a paper that flattered its preconceptions, provided the paper was sufficiently full of jargon. He had drawn his sentences from the academic vocabulary the journal favored: postmodern science, the hermeneutics of quantum gravity, the social construction of physical reality. He had asserted, among other things, that the value of pi is variable, that quantum gravity is a free-floating cultural construct, and that mathematical physics requires an emancipatory intervention from the humanities. Each claim was, by the standards of physics, false in a way that any first-year graduate student would have caught immediately. Social Text did not catch them. On the day the article was published, Sokal published a second article in Lingua Franca explaining that the first had been a hoax. He explained how he had constructed it. He explained why he had constructed it. He noted that the journal's failure to catch obvious physics errors was, by the journal's own standards, a structural failure of the framework the journal advocated. The second article was the move. The first article had been the bait. The second article was the rhetoric, a demonstration that the framework the journal had been promoting, the framework according to which physical reality is socially constructed, scientific authority is patriarchal, mathematical truth is contingent, could not, by its own internal logic, distinguish real physics from constructed nonsense, and therefore failed by the very criteria it claimed to apply. The framework had defeated itself by being unable to defend itself against an attack that the framework's own principles licensed. This is rhetorico argumenti, the turning back of the argument, at the highest level of public deployment in the late 20th century. It is the fourth move in the offensive arsenal and one of the most disorienting to opponents who have not seen it coming. The principle is elegant, and once it is named, you will see it everywhere. A position is vulnerable to rhetoric when applying its own principle to itself produces either a contradiction or an undermining of the position's authority. The vulnerable positions tend to share a structural property. They make claims about the conditions under which claims are valid, and the claims they make about validity apply to themselves. The simplest example, which is now centuries old, the position that there is no truth. If the position is true, it is false, because it is itself a truth claim, and if there is no truth, the claim is not true. If the position is false, it is false. In either case, the position cannot be defended without abandoning itself. The position is vulnerable to rhetoric in its purest form. Applying the principle to the principle produces collapse. Slightly more complex, the position that all knowledge is socially constructed. If the position is itself knowledge, then it is socially constructed, which means it has no claim on truth beyond the social conditions of its construction. The people who reject it are constructing different knowledge, equally valid, by the position's own criteria. The position therefore licenses its own rejection by anyone who happens to be socially situated differently. It cannot defend itself against rejection without abandoning the principle that grounds it. Even more complex, the position that reason is a tool of power deployed by dominant groups to maintain dominance. If the position is the conclusion of reasoned argument, then by its own claim, it is a tool of power deployed by the position's advocates to maintain their dominance. It cannot defend itself against the charge of being precisely what it accuses other positions of being, because, by its own internal logic, the charge applies to it. The advocate can attempt to escape by claiming that their use of reason is somehow exempt, but the exemption requires criteria that the position's general framework does not provide. Each of these positions is held by serious people. Each has produced extensive literatures defending various refinements and qualifications. We are not, in this chapter, judging whether the underlying intuitions behind these positions have merit. The underlying intuitions sometimes do. We are noting only the structural vulnerability. When the principle is applied to itself, the position collapses or undermines its own authority. The collapse is the retorsio. The Indian dialectical tradition had a precise term for this kind of self-undermining. It was called svavekhanabadha, self-statement contradiction. A claim is svavekhanabadha when its content contradicts the conditions of its own utterance. The Sanskrit philosophers, working 2,000 years ago, recognized the structure of the move and developed a vocabulary for the various forms it could take. Shankara deployed retorsio against the Buddhist philosophical schools throughout the Brahma Sutra Bhashya. The deployment is one of the most sustained and important applications of the technique in Indian philosophy. The Buddhist philosophical position, as Shankara was confronting it, included the doctrine of anatta, no self. The doctrine, in its strong form, asserted that there is no enduring self. The apparent unity of personal experience is a momentary aggregation of impersonal mental events with no underlying substance. The doctrine had philosophical sophistication. It had been refined over more than 1,000 years of Buddhist scholarship before Shankara wrote. Shankara's retorsio against this position took several forms in different chapters of the Bhashya. The clearest form was structural. He noted that the Buddhist claim there is no enduring self is made by someone at a specific moment with the intention that the claim be remembered and acted upon. Memory, intention, and continuity are functions that require something that endures across moments. If the Buddhist position is correct, the Buddhist who states the position cannot be the same Buddhist who, a moment later, intends the position to be remembered, who responds to objections, who carries the doctrine into the next encounter. The doctrine, applied to its own statement, undermines the conditions under which the statement could be coherently made. The position is not refuted by being shown to be empirically false. The position is refuted by being shown to be unutterable by its own criteria in any form that would let it be the position it claims to be. This is the high form of retorsio. It does not refute the doctrine by introducing external evidence. It refutes the doctrine by applying the doctrine to itself. The Buddhist response, in the centuries after Shankara, was to refine the doctrine. The Buddhists argued that the no-self doctrine could be held coherently if the apparent continuity of the position holder was understood as a useful fiction, a conventional truth that enabled communication, while the ultimate truth of no-self remained the underlying reality. The two truths doctrine, Samvriti Satya and Paramartha Satya, conventional and ultimate truth, emerged in part as the Buddhist defense against Shankara's retorsio. The defense was sophisticated. It is also, on Shankara's reading and on the reading of subsequent Vedantic commentators, vulnerable to a deeper retorsio. The distinction between conventional and ultimate truth is itself either conventional, in which case it carries no ultimate authority, or ultimate, in which case the no-self claim, asserted as ultimate truth, applies to the asserter, undermining the assertion. The argument runs deep. We will not follow it further. The point is the move. A useful diagnostic, because retorsio is a move you can deploy only against positions that are vulnerable to it, and identifying the vulnerability is most of the work. Once you have identified a retorsio vulnerability, the move is simple to deploy in conversation. You ask, does that principle apply to itself? What happens when we apply it? The opponent has three options: deny that the principle applies to itself, which requires articulating an exemption that the principle's general framework does not license; accept that the principle applies to itself and bites, which is the cage closing; or refine the principle to exclude itself, which requires admitting that the principle as originally stated was incomplete. Each of these is a step the opponent has to take publicly, on the spot, often without preparation. Most opponents, faced with a properly identified retorsio, do not handle it well. A note on what retorsio cannot do, because the move is sometimes overextended by enthusiasts. Retorsio refutes positions that are vulnerable to it. Most positions are not vulnerable to it. The political positions you most commonly encounter: the corporate tax rate should be raised, immigration policy should prioritize X, this military intervention is justified, are not, in their standard formulations, vulnerable to retorsio. They are first-order claims about the world. They can be true or false. They can be supported by good or bad evidence. They can be wise or unwise. They cannot, in general, be refuted by being applied to themselves, because they do not make claims about the conditions under which claims are valid. The positions vulnerable to retorsio are the meta-level positions, positions about meaning, knowledge, truth, validity, language, power, reason. When you encounter a meta-level claim, the diagnostic should fire. When you encounter a first-order claim, retorsio is the wrong tool. Deploy a different move from the arsenal. Most amateur arguers, having learned retorsio, attempt to deploy it against first-order claims. The deployment fails. The opponent looks at them blankly. The audience is unimpressed. The lesson: every move in the arsenal has a domain. Use the move appropriate to the domain, not the move you are most pleased with having recently learned. Reductio, driving to the absurd. In approximately 1590 in Pisa, Galileo Galilei wrote down, in a manuscript he never published, but which survived in his notebooks, the cleanest reductio ad absurdum in the history of physics. The Aristotelian physics of his time held that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones in proportion to their weight. A 10-pound stone, by this principle, would fall 10 times as fast as a 1-pound stone. The principle had been the consensus position of European natural philosophy for nearly 2,000 years. It had been defended by Aristotle's commentators in unbroken succession. It had been incorporated into the official scientific curriculum of every European university. It was, in 1590, what every educated person knew. Galileo asked a question. Imagine, he said, that we tie a 10-pound stone to a 1-pound stone with a length of string. We drop the combined object. What happens? Two answers were available and both were Aristotelian. The first answer: the combined object weighs 11 pounds, so it falls faster than the 10-pound stone alone. More weight, more speed. The second answer: the lighter stone, falling slower than the heavier, drags on the heavier through the string, so the combined object falls slower than the 10-pound stone alone. Drag effect. Both answers cannot be right. The Aristotelian principle, applied carefully, predicts that the combined object falls both faster and slower than its heaviest component. The principle, by being applied to itself in a slightly more careful test case than its formulators had considered, produces a contradiction. The contradiction means the principle is wrong. Galileo did not need to drop the stones from the Tower of Pisa. He did not need empirical evidence at all, in the strict sense. The thought experiment was sufficient. 2,000 years of Aristotelian dynamics were refuted on a single page of reasoning by the deployment of a single move. The move was reductio ad absurdum. Take the principle the opponent endorses, follow its consequences carefully, and demonstrate that the consequences are absurd or contradictory. The principle, by its consequences, refutes itself. This is the fifth move in the offensive arsenal. It is one of the most powerful moves available in any sustained intellectual argument, and it is, by some distance, the most respectable. Reductio is the move that the opponent cannot complain about, because the move uses only their own principles and their own logic. The argument is not from outside, it is from within. The opponent has no external position to attack. The structure of reductio is elegant. You accept, for the sake of argument, the proposition you wish to refute. You derive its consequences using only logical steps the opponent will accept. You show that the consequences include something neither of you can accept, a logical contradiction, an empirical absurdity, a moral monstrosity. The original proposition, by producing the unacceptable consequence, must be wrong. You reject the proposition because you cannot accept its consequences. The Indian dialectical tradition Shankara was trained in had a precise term for this: prasanga. The term is sometimes translated consequentiagument and sometimes reduction to undesired consequence. The Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, whose great exponent Nagarjuna had perfected the technique 600 years before Shankara, took prasanga as the central method of philosophical refutation. The Madhyamaka program was, in effect, to apply prasanga to every available philosophical position until each could be shown to entail consequences its proponents could not accept. Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamakakarika runs through dozens of philosophical positions in this way, refuting each by deriving its undesired consequences. Shankara borrowed the technique from his Buddhist opponents and turned it back on them. This is one of the methodological pleasures of the Brahma Sutra Bhashya. Shankara is fluent in Madhyamaka prasanga, and he uses it against the Buddhists themselves with a precision they would have respected even as it refuted them. Consider Shankara's prasanga against the Buddhist doctrine of Kshanikavada, momentariness. The doctrine, as it had developed in certain Buddhist schools by the 8th century, held that all phenomena are momentary. There is no enduring substance. What appears as a continuous object is in fact a sequence of momentary entities, each replaced by another so quickly that the appearance of continuity is produced. A flame, on this view, is not a single thing burning. It is an unbroken succession of momentary flame events, each succeeded by another. The same applies to physical objects, mental events, and persons. The doctrine had philosophical sophistication, and it was attractive for several reasons internal to Buddhist soteriology. Shankara did not deny the attraction. He noted in Purvapaksha the strongest version of the case for momentariness. Then he applied prasanga. If everything is momentary, he asked, what is it that perceives the succession? The perceiver, by the doctrine, is itself a sequence of momentary perceiver events. But to perceive a succession, something has to bridge the moments, has to connect what was perceived a moment ago with what is perceived now, has to recognize the second as a continuation of or a successor to the first. A momentary perceiver cannot do this. A momentary perceiver perceives only its own moment. It cannot perceive succession, because perceiving succession requires comparing more than one moment, and the comparison cannot occur within a single moment. Therefore, on the doctrine of momentariness, no one can perceive that anything is momentary. The doctrine asserts a property of phenomena, momentariness, that if the doctrine is correct, cannot be perceived. The doctrine cannot be supported by any perception, because no perception of momentariness is, by the doctrine, possible. The doctrine, therefore, cannot be defended on the grounds of being observed, nor can it be defended on the grounds of being inferred, because inference too requires bridging moments. The doctrine, applied to its own conditions of justification, undermines those conditions. This is prasanga in its high form. Shankara did not refute momentariness by introducing an enduring self as a competing hypothesis, although he had reasons to defend the Atman and did so elsewhere. He refuted the doctrine by showing that, on its own terms, it could not be a doctrine anyone could believe to be true. The Buddhist response, over the next several centuries, was sophisticated and partial. Some refinements survived the prasanga and some did not. The history is intricate. The point is the move. In contemporary moral philosophy, The most famous deployment of reductio is Peter Singer's 1972 paper Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Singer began with a premise almost no one would deny. If you walk past a shallow pond and see a small child drowning, and you can save the child at the cost of getting your clothes muddy, you are obligated to save the child. Almost everyone accepts this. The premise is so widely accepted that it is, for most people, not a moral claim but a moral baseline. Then Singer derived the consequences. If you are obligated to save a child whose drowning is in front of you at modest cost to yourself, then there is a principle in play. When you can prevent something bad, a child's death, at a relatively small cost to yourself, muddy clothes, you are obligated to do so. The principle does not depend on geographic proximity. The child's death is bad regardless of where you happen to be standing. The principle does not depend on personal acquaintance. You do not know the drowning child, but the obligation does not depend on knowing them. The principle does not depend on whether others are also able to help. Even if many people walk past the pond, your individual obligation does not vanish. But if the principle is general, then it applies elsewhere. There are children dying of preventable diseases in places far from any pond. You can prevent some of those deaths, at modest cost to yourself, by donating to effective charities. The principle that obligated you to save the drowning child appears, by parity of reasoning, to obligate you to give substantial portions of your income to such charities, until the cost to you approaches the cost of the death you would prevent. Most readers, including most readers in 1972, did not give substantial portions of their income to such charities. Most readers, on confronting Singer's argument, did not start. The argument, however, did not let them rest comfortably with the inconsistency. By Singer's reductio, the conjunction of I am obligated to save the drowning child, and I am not obligated to give to effective charities is inconsistent, and one of the two has to be revised. Singer's argument did not make most people more charitable. It did not need to, in order to count as an argument worth studying. What it did was demonstrate, by reductio, that the principle most people would have endorsed, in the case of the drowning child, when carefully applied, has consequences most people had not realized they were committed to. The position you can defend on Singer's argument is not the position you came in with. It is one of the more demanding positions, and the position most people came in with, moderate everyday charity, does not survive the reductio without significant revision. This is what reductio does to its targets. It does not always change the target's mind. It does always force the target to admit that their original position, as stated, was incomplete or unstable. The honest opponent then refines. The dishonest opponent retreats to vagueness. Either response is a victory for the reductio deployer, because both reveal the original position to have been less robust than it appeared. The warning, reductio fails if any step in the chain is not one the opponent would accept on its own. A reductio that smuggles in a contested premise is not a reductio, it is a strawman with extra steps. The opponent will identify the contested step and reject the chain at that point. The construction is wasted. The construction also fails if the unacceptable terminus is not genuinely unacceptable. Reductio against an opponent who is willing to bite the bullet on the terminus does not refute the opponent. It forces them to commit to the bullet, which they may do, leaving you in the same position you were in before. Singer's drowning child reductio works against opponents who are unwilling to admit obligation to distant strangers. It does not work against opponents who already accept that obligation, because for them the terminus is not unacceptable. The technique is targeted. You must know the opponent well enough to identify what they cannot accept. A note on what reductio is not. Reductio is not the move where you take the opponent's position, exaggerate it, attribute extreme consequences to the exaggeration, and declare victory. That is a strawman dressed in reductio clothing, and the audience will see through it immediately. The exaggeration is the failure. A reductio must use the opponent's premise as actually stated, not a caricature of it. Reductio is also not the move where you list possible consequences without showing they follow. X believes Y, and Y could lead to Z, and Z would be terrible is a common pattern in lazy argument. It is not. Reductio requires that the consequence chain follow by inferential rules the opponent accepts, with no skipped steps and no smuggled premises. The chain is the rigor of the move. When you see what looks like reductio deployed without these properties, you are usually looking at reductio ad absurdum turned into reductio ad ridiculum, reduction to the ridiculous, where the argument's persuasive force depends on the audience's mockery of the consequence rather than on the consequence's actual unacceptability. This is a different move and a worse one. We are training for the high form.